A quick content warning before we begin. Parts of this episode touch on difficult subjects, including child abuse and mental health struggles. We hold these moments with care, but they're part of Dorothy Dandridge's story, and we wanted you to know before going in. Thank you. Los Angeles, spring 1954. Dorothy Dandridge walks into a meeting with director Otto Preminger, dressed exactly as she believes she should be. A tailored suit, gloves, a Peter Pan collar, everything neat, elegant, controlled. Dorothy is here because Preminger is preparing Carmen Jones, an adaptation of the Broadway musical based on the opera Carmen, with an entirely black cast. And Dorothy wants the lead. Preminger knows who she is. By now, most of Hollywood does. She spent years building herself into one of the most polished nightclub performers in the country, with an act that's as sophisticated and glamorous as she carries herself. And almost immediately, it works against her. Preminger looks at Dorothy and sees sophistication. A model, a beautiful, elegant woman, but not Carmen. He tells her exactly that. Preminger has another role in mind. Cindy Lou. Sweet, loyal, the woman Joe is supposed to marry before Carmen gets in the way. Dorothy leaves with an offer, just not the one she came for. So she goes home. And instead of accepting Preminger's judgment, she decides to show him exactly what he thinks she isn't. She loses the polish, the elegance, the careful control. And then she goes back. This time, her makeup is heavier. Her hair is deliberately mussed. A blouse hangs loose from one shoulder. The careful sophistication Preminger had seen the first time is gone. This time, Dorothy Dandridge doesn't walk into the room looking like a lady. She walks in as Carmen. Preminger looks up. For a moment, he just stares at her. My God, a beat. It's Carmen. This time, he gives her a screen test. A few weeks later, Dorothy stands opposite James Edwards before the cameras at 20th Century Fox. Preminger watches. Dorothy is loose, playful, completely at ease. She moves through the scene with the confidence of someone who understands exactly what the character is doing and exactly what effect she's having on the man across from her. And the woman Preminger had nearly sent away without an audition gives what he will call the best screen test I've ever seen. The talent, the experience, the presence, the ability to hold the screen and carry the film. Dorothy Dandridge has all of it. She just had to be given the chance to prove it. Welcome to When They Were Making It. I'm your host, Patrick Rankin, and this is the podcast that dives deep into the glorious, often messy, and utterly human stories behind Hollywood's greatest films and the legends who created them. This is part one of our two-part series on Dorothy Dandridge. Today, we're exploring the young performer who grew up on the road, broke away from the act that had defined her childhood, and set her sights on becoming a dramatic actress in a Hollywood that offered Black women almost no room to do it. Dorothy Jean Dandridge was born on November 9, 1922, in Cleveland, Ohio, the second daughter of Ruby and Cyril Dandridge. Ruby had married Cyril 3 years earlier. He was a cabinet maker and draftsman and was also described as a Baptist minister. Their first daughter, Vivian, had been born in 1921. By the time Dorothy came along, the marriage was already ending. While pregnant, Ruby had left Cyril and taken Vivian with her. Both children would grow up without knowing their father. Ruby Dandridge had been performing since she was a teenager, singing, dancing, working the segregated theater circuits open to Black performers. It hadn't added up to much. Now she had 2 small children to support on her own. But for Ruby, show business was a way out of the domestic work that remained one of the few reliable avenues open to Black women, work she was determined to avoid. Whatever became of her own ambitions, she was equally determined about her daughters. Vivian and Dorothy would never end up in domestic service. At some point in the mid-1920s, Ruby took a partner, a woman named Geneva Williams. The household called her Auntie Mama. Williams moved in and took over raising the girls, while Ruby worked to support the family. Williams was a piano teacher and a strict disciplinarian. She began training Vivian and Dorothy almost immediately. Singing, dancing, and recitation, and she enforced it with beatings when they got something wrong. Dorothy learned the lesson early: get it right, do it well, or pay for it. Ruby soon began putting their training to use. By the time Dorothy was 3 or 4, she and Vivian were performing together as the Wonder Children, a song and dance act built around singing, reciting, and acrobatic routines. The act took the girls through Black churches, schools, and auditoriums across the South. They traveled through Tennessee, Georgia, South Carolina, and beyond, often performing several nights a week, then moving on to the next town. It was part of a larger world: church halls, community auditoriums, Black-run venues built because segregation closed off almost everywhere else, that would later come to be known as the Chitlin Circuit. Ruby usually remained in Cleveland, still working to support the family. She would arrange the bookings, while Williams traveled with the girls, managed the act, and kept them rehearsing between appearances. For close to 5 years, the girls were on the road almost without stopping. Trains, church halls, borrowed rooms, rehearsals, and another performance waiting at the end of the day. There was little room for anything else. School fell away. Dorothy later said she was effectively illiterate as a child, getting by on memorization instead of reading. Touring the South in the 1920s also meant navigating segregation at every stop. Restaurants that wouldn't serve them, water fountains marked white and colored, hotels that turned them away outright, which meant the girls spent most nights in the homes of Black families along the route, the only places that would have them. Through all of it, Williams' beatings continued. None of it was questioned. That was just how it was. Dorothy would later call it an abnormally early baptism into show business, one that had cost her a childhood. Then the Great Depression hit, and bookings began to disappear. The economic collapse quickly reached the churches and communities that had sustained the act. Audiences had less money, organizations had less to spend, and the circuit that had kept the Dandridges working began to dry up. Ruby heard there might be more opportunity in California, in radio, in films, and in the growing Black entertainment community around Hollywood. So, around 1930, she packed up the family and moved to Los Angeles. Los Angeles did offer work, but not the kind Ruby had imagined. She would find jobs in radio and films, but almost always playing maids, cooks, or other domestic servants. The work helped, but in 1930s Hollywood, it came with a bitter contradiction. She would make a living by playing on screen the very kind of woman she had spent years trying to keep herself and her daughters from becoming. Los Angeles was not the segregated South the girls had known on the road, but it was hardly free of racial boundaries. They were still there, in housing, in schools, in employment, and in the parts Black performers were permitted to play. At the same time, the move opened up new opportunities for Vivian and Dorothy. They began receiving a more formal kind of training than Williams alone could provide. They studied at the Lorette Butler School of Dance and the Nash Dancing Company, while Williams continued shaping the act. By 1934, when Dorothy was about 11, the act evolved. Etta Jones, a friend from dance class, joined Vivian and Dorothy, and the trio took on a new name, the Dandridge Sisters. The act had grown more polished. The girls sang in close three-part harmony, danced in tight synchronization, and performed the kind of fast, upbeat novelty numbers that were becoming popular on radio and in nightclubs. That same year, the three entered an amateur contest on Los Angeles radio station KNX, competing against 25 white acts, and they won. The victory gave them their first real attention in Los Angeles and gave them something they hadn't had before, a foothold as something more than a children's novelty act. Vivian, the oldest of the sisters at 13, became the group's practical leader, arranging rehearsals, speaking for them, and helping keep the act moving. Before long, they were represented by Joe Glazer, a powerful Hollywood booking agent who also managed Louis Armstrong. Glazer handled the bookings, contracts, and professional opportunities that began moving them into better rooms and better productions. Williams, however, remained closely involved. Vivian handled the day-to-day and became the trio's public face. Glazer managed the business. Dorothy's mother, Ruby, was nearby but largely absent, still chasing her own opportunities in radio and film. So it was Williams who maintained tight control over the girls themselves. But the work started coming. The Dandridge Sisters began appearing in Hollywood musicals, usually for a single number rather than as part of the story. In the big broadcast of 1936, they performed alongside Black stars including Bill Bojangles Robinson and the Nicholas Brothers. Easy to Take followed in 1936, and the next year brought A Day at the Races and It Can't Last Forever. The appearances were brief, often uncredited, and deliberately self-contained. Black performers could be showcased for a few minutes, then removed entirely when the films played in parts of the country that refused to show them, like the South. But it still helped build their name. Off-screen, They worked nightclubs and theaters around Los Angeles. By 1938, the Dandridge Sisters were no longer simply a local act. They had become polished enough and well-known enough to be booked into one of the most famous nightclubs in the country, the Cotton Club. The Cotton Club had opened in Harlem in 1923, and by this time had long been a fixture of New York nightlife. A showcase for Black performers like Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, and Bill Bojangles Robinson, even as Black patrons were largely kept out. The club catered almost exclusively to a white audience. After civil unrest broke out in Harlem in 1935, many white patrons became increasingly reluctant to travel there. So, in 1936, the Cotton Club closed its Harlem location and reopened later that year, at Broadway and 48th Street, carrying its name, its stars, and its segregated arrangement from Harlem into the heart of the theater district. The show opened on September 28, 1938, on a plantation-themed set. Cab Calloway shared top billing with the Nicholas brothers, alongside the Berry brothers, Mae Johnson, and White's Lindy Hoppers, a who's who of Black entertainers of the time. The Dandridge Sisters arrived as one of the new acts, straight from Hollywood. By now, the child act was long gone. They were a polished nightclub trio, and the Cotton Club put them on the same stage as performers who had already reached the level they were still working toward. Dorothy herself, by this time, was changing too. The little girl from the Wonder Children had grown into a striking teenager, poised, elegant, and increasingly self-possessed on stage. She was still only 15, still 1/3 of a group act, but audiences were beginning to single her out. There was something about Dorothy Dandridge that drew the eye. And at the Cotton Club, one person in particular noticed. Harold Nicholas was 17 years old, the younger half of the Nicholas brothers, already one of the most famous dance acts in the country. He and his older brother, Fayard, had been performing together since childhood, and by the late 1930s, they were bona fide stars. They were the ones sharing top billing with Cab Calloway. As Dorothy would later put it, I saw Harold on the day I arrived at the club. As Harold tapped, he was eyeing me. I had heard of him, had seen photos of him, and I knew that he and his brother were already famous and money-making entertainers. Before long, Dorothy and Harold were seeing each other. For Dorothy, the Cotton Club was becoming more than another booking. She was working in one of the most important rooms in the country, beginning to stand out within the trio, and entering a world that felt increasingly separate from the childhood Williams had controlled. But Geneva Williams' grip hadn't loosened. If anything, the more attention Dorothy drew, the tighter it got. Williams had begun to notice the way men were starting to look at Dorothy, and reportedly moved to suppress it by binding her chest before performances. As for the act itself, the Dandridge Sisters had proven they could hold their own. Over the course of the engagement at the Cotton Club, night after night, they shared the bill with some of the biggest Black entertainers in the country, and showed they belonged among them. One of their next stops would be out of New York, out of the country, and across the Atlantic. They were now ready to go international. In the spring of 1939, the Dandridge Sisters sailed for Europe. The Pittsburgh Courier reported it that March. A 10-week tour of European cities, booked right after their Cotton Club run. In London, they appeared at the Palladium on a bill reportedly topped by comedian Jack Durant, with additional dates around England and in Ireland. While they were in London, the trio cut their first 2 singles for Parlophone, Undecided, backed with If I Were Sure of You, and FDR Jones, backed with The Ladies in Love with You. But away from the stage and the studio, Williams' control over Dorothy was becoming more invasive, and in Europe, it reached a new extreme. According to Dorothy's own account, Williams had become convinced that she was no longer a virgin. One night, while they were in England, she confronted Dorothy about it and tried to force her to undergo an examination to prove it. Dorothy refused. The confrontation became physical, but Dorothy, now 16, was able to fight Williams off. The next day, it was business as usual. Rehearsals, performances, the tour moving forward as though nothing had happened. On September 3rd, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany, and travel across Europe became a different proposition almost overnight. The Dandridge Sisters returned to the United States with a successful European tour behind them. Back home, the work continued. Before 1939 was out, the Dandridge Sisters were on Broadway in Swingin' the Dream, an all-black musical version of Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. In 1940, they toured with Jimmy Lunsford and his orchestra, recorded 4 songs for Columbia, including That's Your Red Wagon and Minnie the Moocher is Dead. And back in Hollywood, they appeared in RKO's Irene, brief and uncredited, much like the film work they'd been doing all along. But by then, Dorothy was growing tired of life inside the trio. For years, every job had meant another rehearsal, another nightclub, another train, another city, always as one of the Dandridge sisters. It was an exhausting way to live, and one she had never really chosen for herself. Now, as more of the attention began falling on her individually, Dorothy started to wonder what she might do on her own. And increasingly, the answer was acting. Not simply appearing in another musical specialty, singing a song that had little to do with the movie around it, but becoming a real working dramatic actress, to play actual characters and build a career on the screen. The idea offered something very different from the life Dorothy had known. She had been touring since childhood, and by now had spent years moving in and out of Hollywood studios without ever being given much chance to act. She knew the world of movies. What she had rarely been allowed to do was become part of the story. Dorothy wanted that chance. Her first real opportunity came outside the studio system. In 1940, Dorothy took her first credited film role in Four Shall Die, a low-budget murder mystery made for Black audiences. She played Helen Fielding, a woman caught up in the murder at the center of the story. The film belonged to what was known as race cinema, movies produced largely outside the major studios, with Black casts and primarily for Black audiences. At a time when Hollywood gave Black actors few opportunities to carry stories of their own, these productions offered roles the major studios often would not. For Dorothy, it was a chance to do what she wanted, play an actual character. Inside mainstream Hollywood, the story was much different for her, and the limits were much clearer. For a black actress in 1940, Hollywood offered almost nothing beyond maids, comic relief, and the specialty numbers Dorothy already knew so well. Her mother, Ruby, had spent years trying to keep her daughters from being confined to the kind of work available to so many black women, and that determination had stayed with Dorothy. She'd been raised to expect more, and she turned down the roles that offered less. It cost her work and narrowed her options even further. It was a difficult line to hold in Hollywood. What she found were small acting roles in mainstream studio pictures. Lady from Louisiana with John Wayne opened in April 1941. That summer, she filmed another small role in Sundown with Gene Tierney. They were minor parts, but they were characters, something fundamentally different from the detachable music specialties Dorothy had been performing for years. At the same time, she was finding work on the stage, this time alone. In July 1941, Dorothy joined the cast of Jump for Joy, a musical revue that opened at the Mayan Theater in Los Angeles. The show featured music by Duke Ellington and a large black cast, and ran for more than 2 months. By now, the Dandridge Sisters were effectively finished. As Dorothy began pursuing work on her own, the trio gradually fell away. Vivian and Etta moving on to other work, just as Dorothy had. With the act ending, Geneva Williams' hold over Dorothy finally began to loosen as well. For most of Dorothy's life, Williams had been there, training her, traveling with her, controlling the act, and controlling Dorothy herself. But Dorothy was 18 now, taking jobs in her own name and beginning to make decisions about the career she wanted. The arrangement that had governed her childhood was finally coming to an end, and something new was just beginning. In late August 1941, Sun Valley Serenade was released and introduced Dorothy to movie audiences across the country. The film was a light studio musical built around skating, romance, and big band numbers, starring Sonja Henie, a Norwegian Olympic skating champion who had become one of Fox's biggest musical stars, alongside Glenn Miller and his orchestra. But the film's standout sequence had little to do with Henie. It had to do with Dorothy Dandridge. The scene, built around the song Chattanooga Choo Choo, opened with Glenn Miller's band rehearsing the new number. Then, the camera moved to a train station set, where Dorothy appeared alongside the Nicholas brothers, Fayard and Harold from her Cotton Club days, as they all took over the next section of the song. The band rehearsal gave way to something looser and livelier, Dorothy singing and dancing with the brothers as the sequence built around them. It was polished, fast, and electrifying, as one critic would later put it, the kind of musical showcase that allowed Dorothy to do everything audiences had been watching her do on stage for years with the Dandridge Sisters, only now in a major Fox picture playing across the country. Sure, it was still a specialty number, separate from the story, and not the dramatic acting work Dorothy ultimately wanted, but this was different. The number itself had become an event, with Dorothy at the center of it. By December, Chattanooga Choo Choo was the best-selling record in the country. The following February, it became the first record ever certified gold. And suddenly, millions of people who had never seen the Dandridge Sisters in a nightclub never caught Dorothy in one of her tiny film roles, never even heard her name before, had seen her. And this time, she wasn't buried inside a trio. After nearly 15 years of church halls, nightclubs, small film parts, years spent almost entirely as part of an act, Dorothy Dandridge had finally, officially, struck out on her own. By the time Sun Valley Serenade was released in the summer of 1941, Dorothy Dandridge and Harold Nicholas had been seeing each other on and off for nearly 3 years. Since meeting at the Cotton Club back in 1938, the relationship had continued whenever their schedules allowed. Their separate, constantly moving careers had made anything conventional almost impossible. Harold traveled with his brother, Dorothy traveled with the Dandridge Sisters, and then began taking work on her own. Their relationship happened wherever their schedules happened to overlap. Dorothy would later describe the courtship as talk, hot dogs, movies, corny as the stalks in Iowa. But it kept going, and she kept working. With the Dandridge sisters behind her, she spent the next year moving between stage work, small film appearances, and a new form of short musical film known as the Soundy, 3-minute performances made for coin-operated movie machines that were beginning to appear in bars and restaurants across the country. She appeared in a string of them, with titles like Cow Cow Boogie, A Zoot Suit, and Lazy Bones among them. During this time, she and Harold became serious, and on September 6, 1942, they married in Hollywood. Dorothy was now 19, Harold 21. The wedding brought together their two worlds of Black Hollywood and show business, with guests reportedly including actress Hattie McDaniel and choreographer Nick Castle. For Dorothy, marriage offered something she had never really had before, a home of her own, and she embraced it. She began pulling back from her career. For the first time since childhood, performing would no longer be the center of her life. She was trying to build something else, a marriage, and a family. At home, Dorothy cooked, kept house, and when Harold was there, the two entertained friends over small dinners. She would later remember this period as one of the happiest of her life. The problem was that Harold wasn't there very often. The Nicholas brothers remained in enormous demand, and he and Faird were constantly on the move. Theaters, nightclubs, film work, sometimes keeping Harold away for weeks at a time. And distance wasn't the only strain. Dorothy suspected, and later said she believed accurately, that Harold had begun seeing other women within days of their wedding. Still, the marriage continued, and early in 1943, Dorothy learned she was pregnant. For the next several months, the pregnancy gave her something else to focus on besides Harold's absences and the growing uncertainty in their marriage. There was a baby coming now, something to prepare for, and a family to look forward to. Then, in September 1943, the pain started, sharp and unmistakable. Dorothy was certain this was labor. As she would later recall, Harold didn't believe her. He was convinced it was too early. So instead of taking Dorothy to the hospital, he dropped her at his brother Fayard's house and went to play golf. Dorothy waited for him to come back. Fayard's wife, Jerry, stayed with her. The hours passed and the pain continued. But even as it became clear that this wasn't a false alarm, Dorothy resisted going to the hospital without Harold. She wanted him there when the baby was born. Eventually, with Harold still gone, a neighbor drove Dorothy to the hospital. By then, she had been in labor for hours. The delivery that followed was prolonged and difficult, and doctors eventually used forceps to help deliver the baby. On September 2nd, 1943, Dorothy gave birth to a daughter, Carolyn Suzanne Nicholas, whom they called Lynn. Dorothy adored being a mother and threw herself into it just as she had marriage. After years of instability in her own childhood, she was determined to give Lynn something different: consistency, attention, and a mother who was there. And she was. Lynn stayed at the center of her life, even as Dorothy slowly began taking on work again. Small parts, here and there, fitted around the life she had built at home. In 1944, Dorothy returned to the stage in Sweet and Hot, an all-black musical revue at Los Angeles' Mayan Theater, and appeared as a singer alongside Louis Armstrong in the film Atlantic City. There was also a fleeting, uncredited appearance in David O. Selznick's wartime drama, Since You Went Away. The following year, she sang with Armstrong again in Pillow to Post. For the most part, it was familiar territory. Singing, musical performances, appearances that gave Dorothy little chance to do the dramatic acting she had once been so determined to pursue. That ambition hadn't disappeared. It just wasn't the most important thing in her life anymore. That was Lynn. But as her daughter grew, Dorothy began to notice something that worried her. Lynn was different from other children her age, from where she should have been by now. She was slow to speak, slow to respond, and increasingly, Dorothy noticed that Lynn didn't seem to recognize or engage with her the way other babies would. By the time she was 2 years old, Dorothy felt this was more than a child simply developing at her own pace. Harold was away in Europe when Dorothy's concern began to harden into certainty. When he returned, Dorothy told him what she'd been noticing. Harold brushed it off, but Dorothy didn't let it go. She couldn't. So she started looking for answers. She took Lynn to doctors and specialists, hoping someone could explain what was happening. One psychoanalyst offered a theory that the damage was emotional, caused by a father who traveled too much, a mother who wasn't solely at home, and a household that just wasn't stable enough. Dorothy didn't believe it. Whatever was wrong with Lynn, she was certain it ran deeper than that. Eventually, another doctor confirmed that instinct. Lynn was diagnosed with severe brain damage. She would never develop normally and would need care for the rest of her life. Dorothy blamed herself. She kept returning to the day Lynn was born, to Harold at the golf course, to her own choice to wait for him instead of going to the hospital alone, even to the forceps the doctors finally used. Whether any of it had actually caused the damage, no doctor could tell her for certain. It didn't matter. Dorothy had already decided. Lynn's diagnosis was devastating on its own. It also landed on a marriage that was already coming apart. Harold was still traveling constantly with the Nicholas brothers, and the absences that had troubled Dorothy from the beginning only grew longer. When he was home, he seemed increasingly distant. Dorothy remained convinced he was seeing other women. The life she had once imagined for the three of them, steady, ordinary, together, was slipping further away. She was trying to hold together a marriage that wasn't working, raise a daughter who would need lifelong care, and make peace with how much of her own life she had put aside trying to make both of those things work. That included her career. As her personal life grew more uncertain, Dorothy found herself returning to her ambition that had been there long before Harold, marriage, or motherhood: acting. She decided to begin taking it seriously. By the spring of 1947, Dorothy enrolled at the Actors Laboratory in Hollywood. The lab, as it was known, had been founded in 1941 by actors and directors who wanted a place in Hollywood where people could actually study the craft, instead of just learning to fit into the studio system. Modeled on New York's influential group theater, it embraced the ideas of Russian director Konstantin Stanislavski, acting built around character, psychology, and emotional truth. It was demanding, it was rigorous, and it was something else, something almost unheard of in 1940s Hollywood. It was integrated. Black and white students trained side by side in the same classes, at a moment when almost nowhere else in the city allowed it. For Dorothy, the lab offered something Hollywood itself had rarely given her: the chance to be treated simply as an actress. She studied there alongside other young performers trying to break through, among them another aspiring actress named Marilyn Monroe. The two became close, sometimes spending entire days at the lab together. When Marilyn forgot her leotard, Dorothy would lend her one of hers. For Dorothy, she began to grow into the work. She'd spent most of her life performing, but this was different. She wasn't just learning routines or polishing a number. She was learning how to shape a character, listen inside a scene, and trust something quieter than the kind of performance she'd been doing since childhood. And she was good at it. But outside the lab's doors, Dorothy still had to contend with an industry that offered Black actresses almost none of the opportunities she was training for. She wanted dramatic roles, she just couldn't find them. And if she wasn't willing to take the kind of parts she had already spent years refusing, the reality was simple: she wouldn't work. At the same time, things at home were becoming even harder. Lynn was getting older, but not more independent. Doctors had begun urging Dorothy to consider outside care, but she resisted. She still wanted to keep her daughter with her. So she wrote to Harold. He had gone back to Europe, where the Nicholas brothers had long found fewer of the racial restrictions that followed them at home. Dorothy wrote to him about Lynn, about the doctors, the care they thought she needed, and how difficult things were becoming back in Los Angeles. Harold's answer made things clear. He told her he was staying in Paris, that she should not expect him to come back or to continue supporting them financially. In short, the marriage was over in every way that mattered, and Dorothy was on her own. Well, not quite. There was still Lynn. She was nearly 5 now, and there was no longer any question about the extent of her disability. Lynn could not speak, and she did not seem to understand that Dorothy was her mother. But she knew Dorothy. Dorothy would later describe it. When she held her, Lynn held back, wrapped her arms around her, and hung on tight, like she meant it. As Dorothy put it years later, she only knows that she likes me and I like her, and she feels warmth and that I'm a nice person. Dorothy loved her, completely, without condition. Underneath it, still, always, was the guilt that she may have caused the very condition in the daughter she loved so much. By this time, it had also become clear that caring for Lynn full-time, alone, wasn't something Dorothy could keep doing. Doctors had continued to tell her, plainly, that Lynn needed more care than she could give alone. And now, separated from Harold, with no one else to share the weight, that was truer than ever. Eventually, she agreed to hand her daughter's day-to-day care over to a family friend named Helen Calhoun. Lynn would live with her, and Dorothy would pay for her care every week. It was a practical decision, the one that made the most sense. But Dorothy would admit years later that it was one she would never be able to make peace with. As she put it, inside I never gave her up. It was myself that I began giving up. By 1948, the marriage Dorothy had tried to save was effectively over, and Lynn was living in someone else's care. Dorothy kept working. She needed to. Lynn's care had to be paid for every week. So she went back to what she knew, performing. She began taking nightclub bookings on her own. At the same time, she kept training. She continued studying acting while working on her dancing and voice, too, trying to strengthen the skills she let fall away during the years when marriage and motherhood had come first. The nightclub bookings came, but the work she could get still came with the same old conditions. Jim Crow wasn't confined to the South. Across the country, segregation was enforced through a mix of law, custom, and private business policy, and the entertainment world was no exception. In 1949, Dorothy took a booking in Las Vegas at a small club called the Bingo. It would be a preview of everything the next several years would look like. She wasn't allowed to stay on the Strip. She was lodged far off it, away from the people she was there to entertain. There was no proper dressing room, something afforded only white entertainers. She could perform for the room and nothing else, not eat with them, not stay near them, not exist among them once the lights came up. But something else happened at the Bingo, too. Something Dandridge would continue dealing with long after she left Las Vegas. One night, when the performance there ended, her body seemed to just give out. In the dressing room after the show, I couldn't breathe, she would say later. I had chest spasms, my legs cramped. I stayed in this contracted fit, doubled up. It wasn't an isolated incident. The attacks kept coming, often after performances, with no obvious reason for why they were happening. Dorothy eventually sought help for them. One psychiatrist believed the attacks were connected to the guilt she still carried over Lynn. Guilt that hadn't disappeared simply because her daughter was now living somewhere else. My paroxysms were a reliving of Lynn's own sufferings, Dorothy would later write. Lynn was never out of my mind. She eventually gave the attacks a name. She called it her own private plague. Over the next year or two, the nightclub work remained steady. Dorothy was getting bookings, reestablishing herself as a solo performer, and keeping herself in front of audiences. But she still hadn't broken through. And that's where Phil Moore came in. Moore was a pianist, composer, and vocal coach who had known Dorothy since she was a teenager, back when he'd worked with the Dandridge Sisters. By now, he'd built a reputation around Hollywood as someone who knew how to take a performer and figure out exactly what worked: the material, the sound, the presentation. He'd worked with Lena Horne, one of the most prominent black stars in Hollywood, and more recently, Marilyn Monroe had studied singing with him too. And in 1951, he turned his attention to Dorothy Dandridge. Moore thought he knew what was missing. Not talent, she had that in spades, but a signature act built around the talent she already had. Moore began working with Dorothy to reshape almost everything. He wrote new material and helped her choose songs that suited the warmth and range of her voice. They worked on how she should deliver them, the phrasing, the movement, the looks she gave the audience, the confidence she projected across the room. And he paid attention to everything around the singing too. The makeup, the gowns, the material, even the rooms she played. Dorothy was already a capable nightclub performer. Moore's job was to turn that into something more distinctive. What emerged was a polished, glamorous, increasingly sensual act built around Dorothy Dandridge herself. They got to work, establishing her as a star in her own right. Things began to move fast. In March of 1951, Dandridge appeared in Tarzan's Peril, playing Melmendi, Queen of the Ashuba. She'd almost turned it down, a jungle picture and a stereotype she'd spent years trying to avoid. But she was drawn to how the part was written, a queen with real dignity. She took it. Censors leaned on the production, pushing back on what they read as sexual undertones in the material. The attention it brought her did more for her career than the film itself. That April, Dandridge landed on the cover of Ebony magazine. The headline made her new persona official: Hollywood's new glamour queen. 2 months later, she opened at the Macombo. The Macombo was one of the best-known nightclubs on the Sunset Strip. It had hosted Frank Sinatra's Los Angeles solo debut, and its regulars included Clark Gable, Judy Garland, and Ava Gardner. In May 1951, Dandridge gave the club one of the biggest opening nights in its history. It was a major break in a room the Strip's top clubs rarely handed to a black performer. In July, Dandridge arrived in London for a month-long engagement at the Café de Paris, one of the city's best-known nightclubs. It was another step up, another room, another audience, and a sign that Dandridge's reputation was traveling well beyond Los Angeles. That October, her divorce from Harold became final. Dandridge was 28 years old. The trio was gone. The marriage was gone. Lynn was no longer at home. And for the first time in her life, Dorothy was building something she had chosen for herself, and something that belonged entirely to her. "1952 brought the engagement that changed everything." That's how Dandridge described it herself, years later. New York's La Vie en Rose, the club owned by Monty Pruzzer on East 54th Street. She was booked for 2 weeks. She stayed for 14. Night after night, the club sold out. What had been a struggling venue, by some accounts close to going under, was suddenly, under Dandridge, one of the hottest tickets in New York. The years of work, the rehearsals, the coaching, the travel, and the act itself were finally paying off on a much bigger scale. But that still didn't necessarily mean better treatment. That same year, Dandridge was booked at the Chase Hotel in St. Louis. Offstage, when Dandridge tried to move through the hotel like any other performer staying there, management directed her toward the service elevator. Her white accompanist, Nick Perito, walked her through the lobby and into the main elevator with him. Dandridge became one of the first Black performers there not only to appear, but to be accommodated as a guest. It was progress, sort of, but it was the kind Dorothy was learning to measure carefully. She could headline the room, she could fill it, and sometimes, if she pushed hard enough, she could even stay in it. By December, Dandridge was back at the Mocambo for a return engagement, given the success of her previous one. It was there that fate intervened in the form of Dory Sherry. Sherry was the man who ran MGM and was one of the most powerful executives in Hollywood. He'd pushed out the studio's longtime chief, Louis B. Mayer, the year before, and he'd already spent years fighting for the kind of pictures Mayer wanted no part of. Where Mayer had wanted splashy, wholesome entertainment, Sherry wanted what Mayer used to dismiss as message pictures, films with something to say. Someone from MGM caught Dandridge's act, passed word along about the woman filling the Mocambo for a second time, and soon MGM came calling. Sherry's first move with Dandridge was small, a walk-on as herself, a nightclub singer, in a picture already shooting called Remains to be Seen. It amounted to $3,000 for a few minutes of screen time. But he was already thinking bigger. He had another picture in development, and this time he didn't want Dandridge to sing. He wanted her to act. The picture was called Bright Road, a modest MGM drama about a young schoolteacher in rural Alabama trying to reach a bright but withdrawn student nobody else could get through to. Sherry wanted Dandridge as Jane Richards, the teacher herself. It was exactly the kind of opportunity Dandridge had wanted all those years ago when she first stepped away from the Dandridge Sisters. A real character, a dramatic role. The film would be directed by Gerald Mayer, the nephew of Louis B. Mayer, and a contract director trying to make a name for himself outside his uncle's shadow. Opposite Dandridge, MGM cast another rising Black performer making his screen debut, Harry Belafonte, as the school's principal. It was a small picture, made quickly and cheaply by MGM standards. Dandridge was paid $1,500 a week. She brought her sister, Vivian, onto the production too, getting her a bit part and work as her hairdresser. Bright Road opened in April 1953. The reviews for Dandridge were strong. The box office wasn't. The film lost money, and whatever hopes MGM had for it as a commercial success disappeared quickly. For Dandridge, at least, the picture had meant something beyond that. She later wrote that the film showed that beneath any color skin, people are simply people. What she wanted, she said, was for a white woman sitting in the audience to watch Jane Richards and think, why, this schoolteacher could be me. Harry Belafonte would offer his own version of why the film mattered. Here was a stunningly gorgeous black woman appearing before the camera, not as a maid or a slave, but as a teacher. Dandridge had finally gotten the dramatic role she'd spent years trying to reach. She'd done it well, but the picture failed and it didn't lead to new film offers. So Dandridge went back to the nightclubs. By now, she was a major attraction. She returned to Las Vegas later that year for an engagement at the Last Frontier Hotel. Dandridge's agent, Harold Jovian, later remembered the hotel giving her quite a rough time. Management made it clear that Dorothy was not to use the swimming pool, and, according to Jovian, threatened to drain it if she did. Dandridge apparently enjoyed testing the restriction. From time to time, she would indicate that she might go for a swim anyway. Management's response was to put up a sign announcing that the pool was under construction. Nobody could swim, which of course was the point. The story would grow more dramatic with time, later versions having Dandridge dip a toe into the water and the hotel immediately draining the pool afterward. What can be traced is ugly enough. By the end of 1953, Dandridge was facing a frustrating contradiction. The nightclub career was bigger than ever, her profile was higher than ever, but the acting career she actually wanted still had nowhere obvious to go. Then a script came along, and this one was different. It was called Carmen Jones. In 1943, Oscar Hammerstein II took Georges Bizet's opera Carmen, moved the story from 19th century Spain to wartime America, and recast it entirely with black performers. Carmen became Carmen Jones, a worker at a southern parachute factory. Don Jose became Joe, a soldier. The bullfighter, Escamillo, became Husky Miller, a prize fighter. The music remained Bizet's. Hammerstein wrote new English lyrics around it. Carmen Jones opened on Broadway in December 1943 and ran for more than 500 performances. One of the people who'd seen the Broadway production was Otto Preminger, the Austrian-born director who, by the early 1950s, was known for films like Laura and The Moon is Blue, and for both his independence and his difficult temperament. When he saw it on Broadway, he didn't like it. Preminger thought the stage version felt less like a drama than a collection of musical scenes loosely strung together. But he believed there was a movie in it, if he could pull the story back toward the darker, more dramatic shape of the original Carmen. What he wanted, he later said, was a dramatic film with music, rather than a conventional film musical. He believed in the material, if he could shape it. Getting anyone to finance it was another story. An all-black cast was still considered a commercial risk in Hollywood. United Artists turned the project down outright. Then Darryl F. Zanuck stepped in. Zanuck, the head of 20th Century Fox, read the script and agreed to finance the picture, while allowing Preminger to produce and direct it independently. The budget would be tight, roughly $750,000, but Preminger had his movie. For the role of Carmen Jones herself, Preminger wanted someone who could carry the sexuality, danger, and unpredictability of the character. Dandridge wanted the part. Preminger knew about Dorothy Dandridge. By this time, everyone in Hollywood did. He just didn't imagine her as Carmen. Still, he agreed to meet with her. Dandridge approached the meeting as she would any professional appointment, presenting the refined, sophisticated image she'd spent years cultivating. It only confirmed Preminger's doubts. "You have a veneer, my dear," Dorothy recalled him telling her. "You look the sophisticate. I've even seen you walking down Fifth Avenue with a red coat flying. When I saw you, I thought, how lovely, a model, a beautiful butterfly, but not Carmen." If anything, he thought she might be better suited to the role of Cindy Lou, Joe's sweet, devoted fiancée. Back home, Dandridge's sister Vivian immediately understood the problem. Dorothy had shown Preminger the poised society woman she'd learned to present in public. Carmen required something entirely different. So the Dandridges began figuring out how to make him see it. Her mother, Ruby, worked with Dorothy on the way she moved, teaching her to put more swing into her hips. Vivian urged her toward what she called a trollopy look. Dandridge went to cosmetic house Max Factor for heavier makeup, found a disheveled wig, and a blouse pulled off one shoulder. Then, before going back to see Preminger, she went to the gym and deliberately exhausted herself. She wanted, as she later put it, a tired look, as if I had worn out a bed. This time, she arrived late to the meeting. The effect was immediate. Preminger agreed to test her. In mid-May, Dandridge returned to Fox and performed opposite actor James Edwards. This time, Preminger got to see what her first appearance had prevented him from considering: the wit, sensuality, assurance, and command she could bring to the character. When the test was over, he called it the best screen test I've ever seen. Carmen Jones was hers. Around Dandridge, Preminger assembled the rest of the cast. Harry Belafonte would play Joe. Olga James, a Juilliard-trained singer and actress, took the role of Cindy Lou. Pearl Bailey would play Carmen's friend Frankie. And a 19-year-old Diane Carroll landed the smaller role of Mert. For Dandridge, getting Carmen should have been a triumph, the moment she'd been working toward for years. Instead, almost as soon as she got the part, she began having second thoughts. Some of it was fear that she simply wasn't good enough. This was no longer a few minutes in a nightclub sequence or a modest drama like Bright Road. Carmen Jones was a major studio production, and Dandridge would be carrying it. But she worried about Carmen herself, too. Carmen was sexually confident, defiant, and completely uninterested in respectability. Dandridge had spent years avoiding playing into Hollywood's narrow stereotypes it usually offered Black women. Now, her biggest opportunity was a woman who could, if she wasn't played right, easily be reduced to another one. For several days, Dandridge stayed inside her apartment, and eventually she told her agent she wanted out. When Preminger heard, he went to see her himself at her apartment. He convinced her she could handle the role, and Dandridge agreed to stay with the picture. But something else happened during that visit. Dandridge and Preminger began an affair. Preminger was married to his second wife, Mary Gardner, and had no intention of leaving her. He was also white. In 1954, that made the affair more than a marital scandal. Interracial marriage was still illegal across much of the United States, and a public relationship between a Black woman and a white man could carry serious consequences, particularly for Dandridge. The relationship would have to remain hidden from the public. In June 1954, work on Carmen Jones began. The music came first. Dandridge was already an accomplished singer. So was Belafonte. But neither had the operatic voice the score required. Bizet's music had to be sung as written, which meant that several members of the cast, including Dandridge, would have their singing voices replaced. For Dandridge, Preminger found a young soprano named Marilyn Horne. Horne was still a student at USC, barely 20 years old, and hardly a famous name. She was paid $300 to provide Carmen's singing voice. Horne worked to make the voice sound as close to Dandridge as an operatic soprano could. Dandridge, meanwhile, studied Horne as she recorded, watching the way her mouth moved, the muscles in her face and neck, the physical effort behind each note, so that when the cameras rolled, she could reproduce it. Filming itself on Carmen Jones began on June 30th. The schedule was short, roughly 6 weeks. The budget left little room for delay. And Preminger, as a director, wasn't exactly known for patience. The set quickly became tense. He clashed with Brock Peters, a newcomer making his film debut, and later with Joe Adams, a Los Angeles disc jockey with almost no acting experience, who was cast as the prizefighter Husky Miller. Both confrontations became heated enough that Pearl Bailey had to step in and calm things down. Dandridge, for her part, kept mostly to herself. She was already conscious that people around the production might suspect what was happening between her and Preminger. She was right. The affair was quickly becoming an open secret among the people working on the film and to Hollywood at large, even if the public knew nothing about it. Still, whatever was happening away from the camera, in front of it, Dandridge was giving her all. When Carmen Jones opened in New York on October 28, 1954, audiences finally got to see what Preminger had seen in the screen test. An actress who could be sensual, defiant, dangerous, and who was completely in control of her performance. The film itself divided critics. Dorothy Dandridge didn't. Variety called her a sultry Carmen whose performance maintains the right, hedonistic note throughout. Walter Winchell reportedly called her bewitching. Audiences responded too. Made for less than $1 million, Carmen Jones became a commercial success, returning about $2.8 million in US and Canadian rentals. For Hollywood, that mattered. An all-black cast had been treated as one of the reasons the picture was supposedly too risky to finance. Now, people were paying to see it. A lot of them. And the attention around Dandridge only grew. Just days after the premiere, the November 1st issue of Life magazine appeared on newsstands. On the cover was Dorothy Dandridge, photographed by Philippe Halsman as Carmen. She was the first Black woman ever to appear on the cover of Life. A few months later came something even bigger, and something Hollywood had never seen before. On February 12th, 1955, the Academy Award nominations were announced. For Best Actress, the nominees were Grace Kelly for The Country Girl, Judy Garland for A Star is Born, Audrey Hepburn for Sabrina, Jane Wyman for Magnificent Obsession, and Dorothy Dandridge for Carmen Jones. 15 years earlier, Hattie McDaniel had become the first Black performer nominated for, and to win, an Academy Award for her supporting performance in Gone with the Wind. Ethel Waters had followed with a supporting nomination for 1949's Pinky. But no Black performer had ever been nominated for an Academy Award in a leading role. Until now. Dorothy Dandridge was nominated for Best Actress. After years of being told in one way or another what a Black actress could be, a specialty performer, a nightclub singer, a maid, a supporting player, Dandridge had reached the very top of her profession. Not simply as a Black woman, as one of Hollywood's leading actresses. She had come a long way to get there, through a childhood spent working, a marriage that had fallen apart, the guilt she still carried over her daughter, and years of fighting for opportunities Hollywood rarely offered women who looked like her. But now, for the moment at least, it seemed as though everything might finally be opening up. Hollywood had made history by recognizing Dorothy Dandridge. And Dandridge, on her own terms and on the strength of her talent, had made it further than anyone before her ever had. The harder questions about what came next and whether Hollywood could offer her anything worthy of where she'd arrived would come soon enough. Very soon. But for now, Dorothy Dandridge had done what no Black actress in Hollywood had done before. She had made it to the top. That's a wrap on this week's episode of When They Were Making It, part 1 of our 2-part series on Dorothy Dandridge. Next week, we'll follow Dorothy beyond Carmen Jones, through Oscar night, the height of her fame, and the complications of being a Black leading lady in an industry that still had no clear place for one. I'm Patrick Rankin, writer, producer, and your host. Original artwork by Simone Beach, and original music by Lionel Zablat. Thank you for listening and for helping keep these stories alive. Check out When They Were Making It, the Backlot, on Patreon for companion episodes exploring each main feed subject, bonus audio stories, and full-length bonus episodes, including Grace Kelly, the movie star and Hitchcock muse who became a princess, and Barbara Stanwyck, the pre-code firebrand who became one of Hollywood's most enduring stars. You'll find the backlot at patreon.com/whentheyweremakingit, or through the link in the show notes. We also post a visual companion for each episode on Instagram with images, added context, and another side of the story. We're at When They Were Making It on Instagram and TikTok. And if you're enjoying the show, please follow us in whatever app you're listening in. It means every new episode lands automatically, and it's the clearest signal to Apple and Spotify that these stories are finding an audience. But the honest truth is, a show like this doesn't grow through ads or algorithms. It grows because one person hears it and tells another. So if this was worth your time, tell someone. That does more than anything else. Until next time, keep watching. And remember, behind every great film is an even greater story.